Michael DeMarco here, Dr. Michael DeMarco, and he and I got acquainted a couple years ago when he was one of the first, I'd say within the first dozen people that applied to the Secular Therapist Project, and we admitted because he actually uses evidence-based psychotherapy methods, which we really like, of course. But so I've only known him for a couple of years. We've had lunch a few times. I'd say we're good colleagues and probably going to be friends sooner or later. But he's really committed to evidence-based psychotherapeutic methods, and that's why we got along so well. As you know, I was trained by Dr. Albert Ellis way back in, I won't say, a long time ago. And one of the first things we learned was something called the ABC theory. Now, I don't know if that's what he's going to talk about here today. I saw ABC of psychotherapy. But it's a very simple model. And Michael uses basically the same concepts that Dr. Ellis first taught us back in the 60s and 70s. A part of rational emotive psychotherapy. How many of you know rational emotive psychotherapy or have heard of it? Okay, several people there. Michael also trains a lot of graduate students. He's got a practice in New York City. He's got a practice here. He supervises graduate students, and we've got some of them here today. Raise your hand. Who are you? Where's our graduate students that came in? Or didn't we have a couple of people? Okay. All right. Two of them. One of them. Just one? You just brought one, Mike. Okay. All right. Anyway, so he's also a sex therapist. And you know, I love sex, so I'm glad some of you didn't know that. Okay. So anyway, let's give a big hand to Michael. We're going to learn a lot from him today. Thanks.
So I'm a psychotherapist. Thank you, Daryl, for the introduction, and thank you, Helen, for letting me speak here. And thank you guys for coming. In New York, the groups that I've been to have maybe 5 or 6 people who show up at a time. So when I came to hear Daryl speak a couple of months ago, I was amazed by the turnout in Kansas City, Missouri. And I knew I had to meet Helen and try to get on the roster to be able to speak to you. And so really thanks for the turnout. It's amazing. So as you can see, I'm a psychotherapist. And I have a story about that sort of maybe was a magical thing that happened to sort of get into my talk. And I've been staying with some friends at the Sheraton while I've been here, and the other day I was leaving the parking lot, and the parking attendant, as I'm paying, says, so what do? You're a pig farmer? And I was like, no. And she's like, well, I you know, with the beard and short hair and I'm like, and the tattoos, you have a problem with the tattoos? And she's like, no, it's not a problem, it's just an observation. And I just try to look at people and see, you know, just try to figure them out kind of thing. So, yeah, what do you do for hobbies? I just wanted to pay for my parking and leave. So I said, well, I enjoy horseback riding, I'm fluent in French, I love world travel. And she's like, oh really, you wouldn't tell that by looking at you. I get a beardy from time to time, but so checking in and out of the parking, I saw her a few more times and I would sort of wave to her. And yesterday, just last night actually, we were pulling into the parking lot and she was waving emphatically, and I saw that really she's flagging me down, and she's like, hey! I figured out who you remind me of. The Unabomber. But not in a bad way. He wasn't always bad. So perception is kind of everything, isn't it? So I think people have expectations of what therapists are supposed to look like or dress like or whatever, and it's kind of my life's work to be able to just help people access therapy and kind of dispel the myths of psychotherapy that you see like on Frasier or, you know, lay down on the couch psychoanalysis from back in the day. And I've been practicing actually since 2002. You couldn't tell it by looking at me, sure. So I've been practicing since 2002, and I've almost from the get-go have been using the same style of therapy, which was conceived by Albert Ellis, Dr. Albert Ellis from the Bronx in 1955, and it was something really ahead of its time. And if you know anything about Beck and cognitive behavioral therapy, Ellis and Beck were sort of neck and neck. That rhymes, I should write a song. It'd be great. Ellis and Beck were neck and neck for sort of cognitive behavioral therapy, and the two theories sort of overlap and have many things in common. And I'm going to sort of do my best to introduce to you how rational emotive behavior therapy works. And really, Daryl mentioned the Secular Therapist Project. Albert Ellis was an out and proud atheist, and if he could do it in the 1940s and 50s, I can do it now. And rational emotive behavior therapy hopefully is the antidote for, the Judeo-Christian moralizing and pathologizing that happens in modern psychology with 12-step programs, and there are still psychoanalysts, believe it or not. And I hope that rational emotive behavior therapy, and the more people learn about it, can be kind of an antidote to that. Albert Ellis was what he called a probabilistic atheist. So the chances that there's a God are so low that it's really not worth mentioning, or not worth much of our time. So you can tell that really excited me, learning about Albert Ellis in graduate school. And it just kind of clicked once I started reading more Ellis. It just was a really pragmatic, approachable style of therapy. He curses like a sailor, by the way, which is always great. And it just kind of clicked with me. So if you imagine psychotherapy on a continuum. On one side of the continuum we have psychoanalysis, and they're maybe trying to answer the question why things are the way they are. So if you're afraid of, what are people afraid of? Spiders? So if you're afraid of spiders, maybe in psychoanalysis on this side of the continuum, would try to answer the question, why are you afraid of spiders? So in order to do that, they're going to have some interventions where you lay down on the couch and talk about your mom and your dreams and your childhood, and to all kind of guess why you might be afraid of spiders. And then insight into your fear of spiders, poof, not afraid of spiders, I guess. I don't know. And this takes 3 times a week for 20 years. It's very expensive. And when we learned about psychodynamic and psychoanalysis, and no offense if there are any people who are into psychoanalysis, of course, when we learned about this in graduate school in Florida, they were like, we're going to teach you this, but you'll never even meet an analyst. No one will do this, unless you move to New York. And then I moved to New York, and every 3rd therapist, I think, is into sort of psychoanalytic psychotherapy. On the other side of the continuum would be something like behavioral therapy. So if you're afraid of spiders, a behavioral therapist would never ask you what happened in your childhood or why you're afraid of spiders. They would really just, through systematic desensitization, or maybe flooding, which would be a horrible thing, but they are going to try to pair relaxation with your stimulus of spiders rather than the reaction of anxiety and panic and fear. So in cognitive behavioral therapy, and this specific type of cognitive behavioral therapy, which is rational emotive behavior therapy, we are more interested in how you're afraid of spiders, how you make yourself afraid of spiders. And you do that by creating a story in your head. So you don't just see a spider for the first time and run out of the room screaming. You've created a story in your head, maybe from childhood, but it's not magical just because it happened to you in childhood. It's not unchangeable. You can work on it now as an adult, or you can work on it as a child, actually. And so we're really interested in figuring out how you're making yourself afraid of spiders. Does it make sense? You with me so far? So spiders are just bugs, and you don't sort of look at a lamp and run screaming from the room, and you can have a panic attack, and you kind of have to ask yourself when you're sort of getting into the mindset of maybe I'm going to work on my phobia, my fear of spiders. You kind of have to ask yourself, well, I just had a panic attack and ran screaming from the room, and the spider doesn't give a care. Try to clean it up a little bit. So what we aim to do in therapy is give people a language and a template to use, sort of like a roadmap, to use to help them figure out how they disturb themselves, how we all disturb ourselves, and how we can learn to undisturb ourselves, as Albert Ellis would put it. And really using an analogy of a language then also kind of takes some of the pressure away of going to therapy. Doesn't that sound scary? Like, in therapy. My therapist told me the other day, in therapy. And I think there's still a lot of stigma about going to therapy. Did it shut off? Can you still hear me? Okay. So there's stigma about going to therapy. And using it as a language, my undergrad was actually in French, and I really sort of identify with teaching people a language and something to implement, a tangible tool to implement in their lives. And the more you practice the language, the more fluent you'll become. But using it as a language also implies that I'm just the maybe French teacher. So I don't know why you're afraid of spiders, or why you get divorced, or why you have sex problems, but it's more like, how are you upsetting yourself about those things? And seeing the role of the therapist as sort of language coach also implies that there are different styles of teaching French, and if you don't like me, there are other ways, other teachers might teach it in a different way, and you could pick up with another therapist, who is up to date. Everything's up to date in Kansas City, right? Who is up to date with cognitive behavioral therapy and rational motor behavior therapy, and so it's not really about the therapist. So maybe we can be a vehicle to help you teach, to help you learn this tool, but ultimately, you're the one doing the work. So it's not, the therapist telling you what story you should tell yourself. It's you're learning how to examine your own thoughts in your own head and hopefully go in a different direction. And the way that we do that is called the ABC self-help exercise, like Daryl said. And I'm gonna do it as if this were sort of a college lecture, so the way that I would do it with students. When people come to therapy for the first or the second session, we do it on paper, and I do it with them. And this is almost word for word how I would do this exercise with a client. So hopefully this will stay on as I'm walking around. So on your piece of paper, which you don't have, sorry, you're gonna write a big A, B, C, D, E. And when people first come to therapy, I think they're really, they don't want to spend a lot of time in therapy, or they're afraid it's going to take years and years. But we're not miracle workers, people. It's not going to happen overnight. So similar to learning a language, first we just have to learn how to conjugate verbs. So that's why we do this exercise in the very beginning of therapy. So from the get-go, you're doing it and you're learning it. So, we can hopefully minimize some of the time that you'll have to spend in the office. And then when you get the basics of it, go speak it. Go implement it in your life, right? So this is sort of similar to conjugating verbs in Latin or French class or whatever. So next to the letter A, we're going to write adversity or activating event. And this just is the first domino in the series of dominoes that begin to fall down when you sort of start to upset yourself. Next to B, we're going to write beliefs. For our purposes, this isn't necessarily your belief in God or the universe or anything like that. It's just anything going on in your head. So it's just another word for cognitions or thoughts. Next to C, we're going to write consequences, of which there are two types: emotional and behavioral. Next to D, we're going to write dispute and debate. Next to E, we're going to write effect, of which there are two types: emotional and behavioral. There's lots of letters and acronyms, and when I first learned about Ellis, I couldn't stand it. It was very difficult for me to grasp, and then just one day it clicked, and I've been using it ever since. So it's helpful to have an analogy. Would you like the New York analogy or the Kansas City analogy? Kansas City. So I used to have a practice in Warrensburg, and I had to drive from the River Market to Warrensburg, and there's something here called the Grandview Triangle. And there was a lot of construction, and do you know when way back there it says merge? But really people will wait until the last minute and then cut in line? Do you know that thing? That pisses me off. So this one day I come over the hill and this was happening, so all these people would try to go to the end and then cut in line, but then that backs up traffic, right? So I'm waiting and I'm getting annoyed. My eye starts to twitch. I have sort of a vein up here that pops out. And as we get closer to the sort of split, so I could go to Warrensburg, people were still cutting in line, and finally it was almost my turn to go, and I was like, surely, it's all gonna, everything's gonna be fine, and like one more person tried to cut in line, at which point I have a meltdown in my car. I'm not made of stone, people. So I have a meltdown, complete hissy fit in my car. honking and whatever, at which point the person who just cut in line just flipped me off and whatever. On my way to do therapy, by the way, in my office, where I'm going to introduce this to someone. You should know. So these things happen, and we say that, like, oh, these assholes in traffic cut me off, and aren't they rude? And, you know, we talk like that. My mom called the other day, and she made me feel so guilty. Or my husband did this, and he made me so angry. I know that we speak like that, but that doesn't really hold water in the style of therapy, and you will see why. Because really, nobody's making you feel things. You are making you feel things. So here's how this works. When we're trying to figure out what the adversity is, or the activating event, we just want to try to figure out factually what happened. So in my whole Grandview Triangle getting cut off in traffic or whatever, what actually happened? Is it factual? We'll do a vote. Do you think it's factual that rude assholes don't know how to drive and they don't know how to read road signs and they got in front of me and they cut in front of me? Is that a fact? Or there's traffic and construction and people are changing from one lane to the other? Which do you think is more factual, A or B? I'm with you, brother. Those other things are interesting. They're not really terribly interesting, but they do belong on the exercise, just not under the A. So really the B one, right? There's people change lanes. That's what really happened. So when you're first learning how to do this, because we talk like the other way, my mom made me feel guilty and things like that, sometimes it's easier to jump to the C because you know in the moment how you feel about it and how you're behaving, right? And so what was my emotional consequence in this traffic thing? What was my feeling?
The blood pressure goes up.
Anger. I was pissed. Anger, right? Sometimes people will say frustrated. No. That was not frustration. I was angry. And then, what was my behavioral consequence in that? While I'm sitting in my car?
You get a big truck and run them off the road.
I would. Yes, I could have run someone off the road. Hissy fit and flipping people off and banging my fist on the horn and whatever it was that I did, right? So we're going to work backwards a little bit. If this were if this were a roadmap, for example, this is where I started and this is where I ended up. But there's a big thing that has to happen in between, and that's everything that's going on in my head. So in cognitive behavioral therapy, there are many different types of cognitive distortions. Albert Ellis in rational motor behavior therapy tries to keep them all related to shoulds and musts, which we call shoulding all over yourself or masturbation. Not mine, I didn't make it up. So who can come up with a should on what might have been going on in my head in this traffic situation? Just a sentence that starts with should. Yep.
They should have moved over when they saw the sign.
People should read freaking road signs. They should have gotten over way back there. What else?
You should be more chill.
I should be more chill, absolutely. That's good. Yeah.
You should recognize that they weren't doing it intentionally to make you mad or angry either.
I feel a little bit beaten up on right now. Yes. The therapist should know better. Yes.
Maybe rationalize and say, well, maybe they need to be someplace before me.
Could be, yeah. But at this point, if I'm trying to be rational, well, I'm not being rational.
They shouldn't be inconsiderate.
They shouldn't be inconsiderate, and that's what they are doing. They're being inconsiderate. And if they're inconsiderate, they're rude assholes. And if people are rude assholes, then they must be doing it to me on purpose. And I can't stand that. And, right? So those, I'm not going to write them all down, but those are types of thoughts that in CBT they call cognitive distortions. And Ellis calls them irrational beliefs. Don't get hung up on the word irrational, but if you're telling yourself things in your head that lead to consequences like anger, or depression, or guilt, or shame, or worry, or nervousness, or fear, or the synonyms that we come up with to go along with those, then by definition, those beliefs are irrational. Those thoughts are distorted. So it's not real that, how dare they do that to me? I have no proof that they're waiting for me at the Grandview Triangle. Look, there's that guy. Let's all get in front of him. Piss him off. The thing that happens next is, I don't want to make it too complicated, but sometimes your response, sometimes your consequence, can become a new adversity. as someone said up here, that I should know better. So my new adversity becomes, oh shit, I lost my temper again. And then my beliefs about that are, but I'm a therapist. I should have all my issues worked out. I'm a fraud. I'm a terrible person and a therapist. And yeah, what the hell do I know is I'm on my way to do therapy. It's awful. And then, what do you think my consequence is if I'm telling myself that in my head?
Lower self-esteem?
Maybe low self-esteem, I feel guilty. And I don't really have a behavioral response, maybe blushing or something. And then, you know, it's not enough that this traffic thing happened and he made himself angry. Now the poor guy feels angry and guilty about feeling angry. So we call it feeling bad about feeling bad. So we're sitting there, we started here, we ended up here lost a little bit with some, what we call unhealthy negative emotions. Not abnormal, just unhealthy. And, you know, now we have a better idea of how we got there. So in order to get sort of unlost, we need, we'll call it a compass. And our compass has 3 parts. So the first part is called unconditional self-acceptance, or Ellis calls it USA. The second part of the compass is called unconditional other acceptance, or UOA. And the third part is unconditional, the third part of the compass is unconditional life acceptance, or ULA. So unconditional self-acceptance, how could we define that? I mean, it might be in the word. Yeah, it's just learning to accept yourself, warts and all. You're entirely human, even if you lose your temper, or drink too much, or have other problems, and panic attacks and things like that. All those things happen to humans. So you're not superhuman, because there aren't superhumans, and you're not subhuman, because there aren't subhumans. You're just human, with your panic attacks and your road rage and your whatever. So unconditional self-acceptance, love yourself, warts and all. The second one, unconditional other acceptance, how might we define that? Yep. They're also human. Even they might be bad, I might think that they're bad drivers. Even to the extreme, people might rape and pillage and murder. You don't have to like it, but you have to tolerate that that's what humans might do. Make sense? The third part, unconditional life acceptance. Any guesses?
That's life. Yeah, life's not fair.
Sometimes life sucks. These things just happen. The traffic gods aren't putting people in your way on the way to work. The universe is not your cosmic cash machine. So there's no sort of, why me? Why not you? We're all ants in the universe. Sometimes traffic happens, or testicular cancer, or whatever. Hold on tight, it's a roller coaster, all those cliches. That's unconditional life acceptance. So now that we have a compass, we're going to get to the juicy part of therapy, which is learning how to dispute and debate the things that we taught ourselves at B. And we teach ourselves this our whole lives, these things, those cognitive distortions, maybe from childhood and school and church and magazines and TV and movies and whatever. Who cares where we pick them up? But we have them, those distorted thoughts. You with me so far? So it doesn't really matter why. So maybe an analyst might say, well, you learned this from your childhood, from your mother, because she was whatever. So that doesn't make it magical. That doesn't make it unchanging. And frankly, anyone that can tell you why you are the way that you are is full of shit. Because there's infinite number of reasons why you are the way that you are. So it's more like, how do you upset yourself? And even when you do upset yourself, you're also okay. So again, in therapy, unconditional self, other, and life acceptance are what we're trying to teach. So using these as our compass, that whole people shouldn't be rude, and if they are rude, then they're assholes and I can't stand it. How can we dispute and debate that belief? Using sort of proof.
It's not about you.
It's not about you, don't take it personally. Perfect. What else?
Maybe nobody taught them that.
Maybe nobody taught them better. People are allowed to be at their worst sometimes. That's the unconditional other acceptance. I don't actually have proof that people must be polite, because I just told myself that that person was being a rude asshole. So how can both of those things exist? If people are supposed to be polite, they would be. It gets a little philosophical, right? Do you get what I mean? So if you drop the marker, like, it's gonna fall, because that's how it's supposed to work. So if people were supposed to be polite, we would be. We'd be, no, after you. No, after you, I insist. No, after you. And the world would be awesome. So we can also dispute and debate that secondary stuff of me beating myself up. So that's the unconditional self-acceptance. So do I have proof that, like, people shouldn't lose their temper? No. So when you're charting this out and writing it down, you could just, that's changing your thinking this much, and you can just start with that. I don't have proof that I'm not allowed to lose my temper. If I weren't programmed that way or whatever, I wouldn't have lost my temper. Do you get it? So people train themselves to have these cognitive distortions, this irrational thinking, and we pick it up from all over the place, even therapists. And then we train ourselves to have our go-to emotions. So this might happen to somebody else, and they may have a total panic attack in their car. I don't really worry so much. I get it. I understand anxiety and panic, but I don't really feel too anxious very often. I also don't get terribly depressed. Guess what my go-to emotion is?
Anger.
Hell no, we won't go! I'm very often righteously indignant, which is a fancy way of saying angry and pissed. So if something happens, I don't worry about it. I don't feel depressed about it. I get angry, and then I feel guilty about getting angry right after that. So we can also say, like, you can get angry. It might not be healthy, but maybe we also drink too many lattes. That's also not healthy. But you're not abnormal. You're not inhuman because you did something unhealthy. So again, going back to the language analogy, you just made a thinking error. Isn't that way more awesome than sort of having a concept of, like, being mentally ill? You made a thinking error, and you believe that a lot, and you've believed it your whole life, or whenever you began, thinking this way. So spiders, for example, sure, maybe you picked up something during childhood. So then every time you see a spider, you rehearse it, and you train yourself to sort of, oh my God, it's a spider! Get on the chair, or whatever it is that you do. And that's your go-to emotion, maybe. So what are some other, how else might this work? What are some other examples, not just anger? Do you have any activating events that we could go through? No, too soon? Okay. So, that's kind of the nuts and bolts of it. After you can dispute and debate the irrational beliefs and the cognitive distortions, you'll end up at E, which is a new effect. So the new emotional effect of telling yourself, well, I don't have proof that people should behave any differently than what they do. I don't have proof that I'm an asshole or a jerk because I lost my temper. I don't have proof that the universe is out to get me because they put traffic at work at the Grandview Triangle, or that they put the Grandview Triangle there. So my new effect of that, when I really believe that, is maybe something like frustration, annoyance. No one has a hissy fit in their car because they're mildly annoyed. People have road rage. It's called road rage, right? Because you're enraged, because you're angry, not when you're mildly annoyed. If you're highly frustrated, it's fine, we can work with that. Those are called, those are called healthy negative emotions, and that's what we're trying to get people to come to. And then the behaviors that go with healthy negative emotions won't make sense. They won't be like the ones that you came up with at C. So hissy fits don't make sense when you're mildly annoyed. You roll your eyes, you turn on the radio, and you go about your day. Do you see what I mean? But it's not just pretending and thinking new thoughts in your head and just poof, it's all better. It's still therapy. It takes some time. It doesn't happen overnight. But a bit of therapy is to prove to yourself that your new way of thinking is true. So there are different ways that we can do this, but it sort of is designing experiments for yourself to prove your new way of thinking. So sometimes we do something called shame attack exercise, so when I was doing this in grad school, my shame attack exercise was do you know what a muumuu is? Or a house coat? I wore one to Bed Bath & Beyond in the suburbs, BB&B. And I was mortified because I blushed and whatever. I was completely embarrassed and like, oh with sheets. I made some sheets. And I was mortified, but to prove to myself that like, it kind of doesn't matter. Like maybe someone was like, look, mommy, so what? That didn't make me melt into a puddle on the floor. And sometimes experiments can happen magically. They just sort of, not really magically, but coincidentally, and they will just present themselves. So about a year after this Grandview Triangle thing happened, I was on the way to the movies at Zona Rosa, by Zona Rosa. And I was tailgating the lady in front of me, because I do. Sorry. And a person out of nowhere, she also happened to be a lady, it doesn't matter, but this person out of nowhere sort of gets in between me and the car in front of me, at which point I'm like, eye twitch, vein pop, I'm feeling it coming on. And then I'm like, wait, stop. And I could sort of see it like laid out sort of in front of me, that you can either get pissed, nobody died, nobody wrecked, and I sort of made myself react differently, at which point, instead of flipping her off, I went and then waved at her. And she was like, oh, and like waved and was like, because she didn't even see me, I was just in her blind spot. Do you know what I mean? And then I was giggling, like embarrassed and laughing at myself, like these people think I'm crazy. Just in my car like, hey. So you can't always preempt it, but that's a great thing about having it be a language. Like, I might have made grammar mistakes today. Really, English is my first language, but who cares? I'm still fluent. So you may make mistakes. Like, I'm not always able to preempt getting angry. I'm pretty good at cleaning up my mess when I do. It doesn't take too terribly long, but you can get angry. You can feel depressed. Clean it up. And you have an option to learn how to do it. That's not sort of, oh, I have this diagnosis, this lifelong diagnosis, and there's no hope. Daryl mentioned evidence-based therapy. Cognitive behavioral therapy and rational motor behavior therapy are evidence-based styles. They're extremely effective with mood disorders and helping people sort of take control over their emotions a little bit. But it's also a very compassionate style of therapy. So we're not saying don't get angry. Nobody's there to wag their finger in your face. We're saying, you got angry? How'd that work out for you? Okay, feel it, you're fine, you're completely human. That must have sucked for you, sort of having a hissy fit in your car. Awesome. But how can you learn which one of those beliefs were rational and helpful for you, and which one of them is keeping you angry? And you can learn how to do it. So the therapist is never telling you, well, don't get angry. It's not what I do. And they don't say, well, if I were you, next time I would try, blah, blah, blah. It's also not advice. So it's a tangible, provable, you-oriented way, a very compassionate way to learn how to unupset yourself. Does that make sense? I know it sounds super simple, right? There are lots of books about it. And I learned how to do it. And I'm not magical either. So you can learn how to do it, and that's ultimately what we're trying to do as therapists, and CBT and REBT is to help you learn how to become your own therapist. So I think we're going to do Q&A, so you can put me in the hot seat, and yeah.
Yeah, so we'll take a few questions here. Please make sure to keep them short since we're running low on time, and also make sure that they are questions, and keep it just short to 2 to 3 sentences, please.
I've heard that the overwhelming majority of therapists are religious. I've also heard that in some cases Christianity might be a barrier to, I guess, self-acceptance.
Would I care to comment?
Yeah,
Yes.
Is that a question?
Yes, I would care to comment. I was actually trained in psychology. My master's is in psychology. My emphasis was marriage and family therapy. Sorry, Daryl. It wasn't a religious school. But yeah, marriage and family therapy, the agenda is built right in there, isn't it? So in New York, I'm also a licensed mental health counselor. In Missouri, I'm a licensed professional counselor. So I lean towards that one if I have to identify some sort of way. But right, lots of marriage and family therapists, and frankly many psychology programs at the master's level and social work programs are in religious schools. So then how do you teach, objectively teach Albert Ellis and Beck and cognitive behavioral therapy or whatever without moralizing and yeah, I mean therapists, there are lots of bad therapists. There are lots of bad CBT therapists. CBT is also taught poorly a lot, so is REBT. So if you go and end up with more dogmatic, absolutistic type of thinking from your therapist, don't get divorced because God will let up. That's just more shoulds that they're shoulding on you. Do you get it? You should come back 4 times this week because I really think. So yes, there are lots of religious therapists, just like there are lots of people who are religious, and sometimes that can be dogmatic, absolutistic type of thinking, whether it's orthodox, whatever, or whomever, that absolutely can be a barrier. And Albert Ellis in 1955 was already coming out and speaking against that. Yeah?
In the unconditional other part, how do you kind of balance that with, yes, humans mess up, but how do we also weigh that against humans are doing something wrong and we should be chastising them for things like, you know, their thoughts on gay marriage or being against it? How do you say it's okay to mess up, but at the same time be critical of other people's mistakes?
The way to do it is that B is black and white absolutistic type of thinking. Like, I need people to agree with me, and I'll be atheist, and I'll be super liberal, and I'll be blah, 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 blah. That's demanding, where at D we want strong preferences. And when you're annoyed and frustrated, you do activist work, or you try to affect change somehow. But when you're angry about it, how's that feeling for you right in the moment? Anger's fine, it's totally human, it's just not healthy. So if you're trying to argue with someone about your political views or your religious beliefs or philosophical beliefs and you're angry, is that going to work out the best for you? As opposed to if you're frustrated and then you pass around a petition or something. Does that make sense? Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Yeah. And then back.
So sometimes when you're at the C point, there's a certain kind of satisfaction that you get with this righteous indignation or even the wallowing in self-guilt, you know? How do you break out of that to get to the rational disputing debate?
I think the whole first stage of therapy, in the way that I do it, and it's however long it takes, but the whole first stage, people aren't ready to hear, like, he broke up with me, I broke my heart, and he's a complete asshole. They're not ready to hear, like, he's just a human. Not quite yet. We're not to that. So the whole first stage of therapy is learning how to be laser focused on how people invent things, how you are inventing things in your head. All those shoulds and whatever. Awfulizing, catastrophizing, like there's a whole list of different ways. But in RABT we say shoulds and musts. So he shouldn't have done that, it's not fair, he must hate me or whatever. So we're just learning how to identify it and then recognize the emotion that you're feeling as a result of those beliefs. So when you get really good at that, you're like, wait, just because I'm thinking it and feeling it, that's not factual. Do you know what I mean? And at some point, you're ready to go to the D part of disputing and debating. And it's not the therapist and the client disputing and debating. That's not it at all. It's us together, outside of you a little bit, like on paper, being able to say, like, these beliefs will always lead you to feel anger, it seems like, historically. So these beliefs, the dispute and debate ones, the more rational ones, yeah, it's not going to lead to anger anymore. It already feels different. They're like, I would love if people agreed with me, but they don't have to, and they're not going to. That's not meant to lead to apathy, and that's not meant to get a person to feel like no emotions. So it's a really compassionate, emotions are in the title of the therapy. So emotions are fine, unhealthy or not, but some of them are going to keep you stuck.
I think we have time for one more
question. One more. Someone in the back? Yeah?
I think you may have sort of started to touch on it with your most recent answers, but I work a lot with kids who've experienced abuse and neglect. And so this idea of not imposing the shoulds on ourselves is very important. But I'm wondering, how do you distinguish that, particularly for children, between there are shoulds for adults? Like, how do you define this? How do you differentiate between like the artificial shoulds that we impose on ourselves and responses to abuse?
I don't specialize in working with kids, and honestly, there are people who do and use RABT to do it and make it translate it in a way that will make sense for kids, just like language. So you use kid-type analogies. But imagine, abuse out over here. But imagine like if the kid is afraid of the dark and thinks that there's a monster under the bed. You make it sort of experiential. That you look under the bed, you try to sort of prove, say like, well, it seems like you're afraid because you think there's something under the bed, but ultimately let's figure out our routine and like how we can keep a light on, look under the bed, and whatever, in order to challenge what's still irrational thinking. Now, working with adults who have traumatic pasts, just because it's trauma, it still doesn't make it magical. At the ABCDE part, at the A, we would call something traumatic a strong adversity. So probably, if something traumatic happens, if we did a poll, maybe many of us would respond in the same way, with PTSD type symptoms or a strong panic or guilt or fear or whatever. But that still doesn't make it, even if it's a strong adversity, this is where it's a little bit Buddhist in influence, that like, things are just things, events that happen in the universe. We're the one that puts meaning on it, period. So working with children, I don't have a great answer for it, for that specific situation, but working with adults who have traumatic pasts, absolutely. You're not a child now. Or here's how the ways that you're upsetting yourself. It's not fair that this happened to me, it's awful, this was a defining moment of my entire life. Versus, I hate that that happened to me, I prefer that that didn't happen to me, but I'm still alive. And if you're spending your whole time looking backwards, your life is still happening, and you're just gonna trip over stuff now. Does that make sense? Sorry for the first part, isn't such a great answer. Thank you very much. Talk to me.